In the waning days of August 1944, deep within a dimly lit command post somewhere in northern France, a German major from the Quartiermeister, logistics staff, sits hunched over a cluttered wooden table. The flicker of a kerosene lamp throws long, wavering shadows across maps littered with pencil marks and arrows now obsolete. His gloved hands tremble slightly as he unfolds the latest reconnaissance report from the front. Outside, the muffled rumble of retreating convoys echoes through the night, the sound of an army in collapse. He begins to read aloud, his voice low, strained with disbelief, yet tinged with professional curiosity. Report, Route N13. Endless columns of enemy trucks. Northbound traffic does not stop, even at night. Estimate thousands of vehicles daily. This cannot be sustained. The words hang heavy in the air, almost absurd in their implications. For months, the German command had comforted itself with the belief that the Allied supply lines would choke under their own weight, that no army could maintain such momentum across the ruins of France. Yet here was proof to the contrary. The Red Ball Express, though unknown to him by name, had transformed the impossible into routine, an unbroken stream of fuel, ammunition, and men surging toward the front with mechanical precision. The major lowers the report, staring at the maps as if seeing them anew. Every road, every bridge, every town once under Wehrmacht control now serves the enemy's advance. The logistics officer, trained to measure victory not in heroics but in tonnage and timetables, realizes what the generals above him do not yet grasp. Germany has not only lost the battlefield, it has lost the war of movement. The engine of Allied industry, roaring down Route N13, will not stop. To the German military mind, trained in the precision of timetables and the discipline of rationed momentum, the reports from France defied logic. For decades, the Wehrmacht's doctrine had been built upon the strict geometry of supply, railheads feeding depots, depots feeding divisions, every movement calculated, every pause deliberate. Warfare, to them, was a problem of control, of measured advances and methodical replenishment. Yet now, in the summer of 1944, those familiar equations had collapsed. Reconnaissance described not an orderly front, but an unbroken flood of motion. Trucks roaring through the night, headlights masked but unceasing, engines growling across liberated France as if the very laws of logistics had been rewritten. But this was no fantasy. It was the Red Ball Express, the improvised lifeline of an army that had outrun its own supply chain. Born from crisis and necessity, it embodied a form of warfare that the German High Command could neither anticipate nor replicate, a system powered not by rails or doctrine, but by the raw abundance of American industry. In that endless stream of vehicles, the Wehrmacht confronted not merely a new tactic, but an alien idea. That material might, when harnessed with urgency and improvisation, could conquer what strategy alone could not. In the summer of 1944, the Allied armies found themselves trapped in a paradox of their own triumph. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, shattered the static trench-like stalemate that had defined the Normandy front since D-Day. Animated maps of the campaign tell the story with ruthless simplicity. For weeks, the front line barely budged. Then suddenly, a great arrow explodes westward and southward, a breakout so swift it outpaced every forecast. The success was dazzling, but it also birthed an unforeseen crisis. Allied planners, cautious and deliberate, had prepared for a slow, attritional advance, perhaps 10 to 15 miles per day. Their intricate logistical systems were built around that assumption, a rhythm of supply that could support steady but methodical progress. Yet reality defied their projections. Armored columns under General George S. Patton's newly activated Third Army were now advancing 40 miles a day, sweeping across France with a velocity no quartermaster had dared predict. In the euphoria of victory, a quiet panic began to spread through the supply echelons. Fuel dumps emptied faster than they could be replenished. Ammunition convoys struggled to locate divisions that were already hundreds of miles beyond their planned destinations. The very success of Cobra, the breathtaking momentum of Allied mechanized warfare, had outstripped the infrastructure designed to sustain it. In a grim irony, the liberating forces of Europe had become victims of their own spectacular success. The Allied advance across France in the late summer of 1944 concealed a crippling truth beneath its triumph. The deeper they pushed into liberated territory, the weaker their logistical foundation became. Archival footage from the time tells the story in stark images. The port of Cherbourg reduced to twisted steel and rubble, railway bridges shattered by retreating German engineers, and entire stretches of track torn up or mined beyond use. The German scorched earth policy, born from desperation, had achieved a brutal efficiency. Every mile gained by the Allies came at the cost of infrastructure annihilated in their path. Victory on the battlefield had not translated into logistical freedom. Though Allied columns surged eastward, their lifelines remained anchored to the Normandy beaches, makeshift ports that had been intended only for the initial invasion, not for sustaining an entire continental campaign. The grand ports of northern France were still unusable. The one surviving Mulberry artificial harbor at Arromanches groaned under the impossible burden of feeding and fueling millions of men and vehicles. The result was a paradox of modern warfare, an army that could outfight any enemy but risked starving amid its own success. For the first time, it became clear that the true enemy was not German resistance. It was distance itself. The Allied armies that thundered across France in the summer of 1944 were not merely fighting machines. They were moving cities, consuming resources on a scale unprecedented in human history. Charts and records from the period lay bare the staggering arithmetic of modern warfare. A single U.S. infantry division required hundreds of tons of supplies each day just to function. Crates of ammunition for rifles and artillery, rations for tens of thousands of men, medical kits, spare parts, and clothing. For armored divisions, the appetite was even greater. During active operations, one such formation could devour up to 400,000 gallons of gasoline per day, enough to drain a small refinery before sunset. Each shell fired, each tank engine ignited, each mile advanced demanded a logistical miracle repeated endlessly across the front. The numbers multiplied mercilessly. Over 20 Allied divisions were pushing eastward, consuming more than 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. Feeding this insatiable beast required not only trucks and depots, but an entire industrial empire working in perfect rhythm across an ocean. By late August, the limits of that system were showing. Fuel convoys crawled along congested, cratered roads. Supply depots ran dry faster than they could be restocked. The enemy's resistance was faltering. Yet the Allied advance itself teetered on the brink of collapse. It was not German panzers that threatened to halt the liberation of Europe, but the cold, empty silence of fuel tanks running dry. To understand the German reaction to the Allied logistical revolution of 1944, one must first grasp the nature of their own supply doctrine, a system rooted not in flexibility, but in precision and control. The German war machine, for all its tactical brilliance, was built upon the rigid geometry of the Reichsbahn, the vast European railway network that had sustained the Wehrmacht since the days of Blitzkrieg. Archival images reveal the rhythm of this system. Endless trains clattering through the night, soldiers methodically loading ammunition, fuel, and rations with mechanical efficiency. This structure excelled at what it was designed for, moving immense quantities of material from centralized depots to established railheads close to the front. It was an engineer's dream of order and regularity, but within that order lay its fatal flaw. The entire apparatus depended on fixed infrastructure, rails, bridges, and switching yards, all of which were vulnerable to modern warfare's newest weapon, Allied air supremacy. Once the skies over France and Germany belonged to the enemy, every train became a target, every junction a potential graveyard of steel. By mid-1944, Allied bombers and fighter bombers systematically dismantled the Reichsbahn's arteries, striking bridges, tunnels, and marshalling yards with ruthless precision. Meanwhile, the French resistance waged its own silent war, derailing trains and cutting communication lines, compounding the chaos. What had once been the pride of German logistical science became a liability, a centralized system paralyzed by the very predictability that once made it strong. When the Allies replaced rails with roads and trains with an endless tide of trucks, the German command could only watch in disbelief. They were witnessing a new kind of warfare, one their doctrine had never imagined. Perhaps the most revealing image of the German logistical dilemma is not the roar of a Tiger tank, but the weary creak of wooden wheels in the mud beside it. Archival footage captures this jarring contradiction with haunting clarity. Columns of horse-drawn wagons struggling through rutted roads, their drivers cloaked in rain, pulling supplies meant for some of the most advanced machines of war ever built. It is a tableau that speaks volumes about the structural paradox of the German war effort. 20th century weapons sustained by 19th century means. By 1944, the Wehrmacht, often romanticized as a fully mechanized force, still relied on over 1.2 million horses across all fronts. A typical Volksgrenadier division fielded thousands of horses, but possessed only a few hundred motor vehicles, most of them reserved for command or emergency transport. This dependence on animal power was not a relic of tradition, but a necessity born of scarcity. Germany's limited oil reserves, disrupted industrial output, and Allied air attacks on fuel infrastructure made full mechanization impossible. The consequences were profound. Horse-drawn logistics could not keep pace with the tempo of modern warfare. Supplies that might take hours to deliver by truck required days by wagon. In rain or snow, entire convoys bogged down, immobilizing units at critical moments. The result was a fatal mismatch between the Wehrmacht's tactical brilliance and its logistical reality. A military that could conceive lightning war, but could no longer sustain it. In the end, the German army marched toward defeat not only on steel tracks, but on hooves. To the German military mind, scarcity was not merely a condition, it was a worldview. Years of Allied blockades, dwindling oil reserves, and resource starvation had conditioned both planners and soldiers alike to think in terms of limits, not abundance. German propaganda posters from the period illustrate this mindset vividly. Bold red letters urging citizens to save fuel, conserve rubber, recycle metals, and economize for victory. Every drop of gasoline, every shell casing, every horseshoe was to be measured and justified. This culture of meticulous conservation permeated the entire command structure. The Wehrmacht's logistics officers were trained to stretch every resource to its breaking point, to make scarcity a form of discipline. Efficiency was equated with virtue. Waste in men, material, or fuel was seen as moral failure. As a result, the German military became deeply suspicious of what it perceived as wasteful methods of warfare, the kind that relied on overwhelming production and brute industrial force rather than precision and restraint. When faced with the Allies' seemingly reckless consumption, convoys of trucks burning thousands of gallons daily, artillery batteries firing without ration, German officers viewed it as madness, a fevered display of material arrogance. Yet behind that excess lay the essence of modern warfare, the ability to wage not just battles of men and machines, but of economies. In 1944, Germany's obsession with conservation had become its greatest weakness, while America's capacity for waste had become its most devastating weapon. The American response to the looming logistical crisis was not elegance, it was brute force, industrialized. In August 1944, as fuel and ammunition dwindled at the front, U.S. Army logisticians conceived an audacious experiment, turned the very roads of France into a mechanized conveyor belt of war. Thus was born the Red Ball Express, not merely a convoy system, but the militarization of a nation's highway network, applying the principles of the factory assembly line to the open road. Animated maps of the period show its genius in motion. Two great one-way loops stretching from the beaches near St. Lo to Chartres, one for northbound loaded trucks, the other for empty returns. This closed circuit pulsed day and night, a living artery feeding the front. The rules of this system, the so-called 10 Commandments of the Red Ball Express, transformed chaos into choreography. Every truck maintained a strict 25 miles per hour, spaced 60 yards apart, forbidden to overtake. Military police enforced discipline with absolute authority. Speeders, stragglers, and rule breakers were pulled from the line without mercy. The highways were cleared of all civilian traffic. Nothing moved on them except Red Ball trucks. 2 drivers per vehicle ensured nonstop operation. While one drove, the other slept. Maintenance depots, fuel points, and mess tents functioned like pit stops on an endless race course. It was logistics turned into industry. A mobile assembly line stretching across the French countryside, delivering war at a pace the Germans could scarcely comprehend. In this system, America's defining strength, its ability to mass produce, to organize, to simplify the impossible, found its purest expression. The heart of the Red Ball Express was not its organization alone, but the machine that made it possible, the GMC CCKW, affectionately known to every driver as the Deuce and a Half. Rugged, simple, and endlessly reliable, this 6x6 workhorse became the backbone of Allied mobility. Archival footage and technical cutaways show why. Its triple axle drive conquered mud, rain, and rubble alike. Its modular bed carried everything from fuel drums to artillery shells. Designed for mass production rather than luxury, it was a truck that could be repaired with a wrench, a hammer, and sheer determination. The scale of its manufacture remains staggering even by modern standards. The United States produced over 560,000 CCKWs during the war, an industrial feat that dwarfed the imagination of German planners, whose total truck production across all models barely approached a fraction of that number. To the logistics officers of the Wehrmacht, who measured every drop of fuel and counted every tire, this single vehicle's production run was incomprehensible, proof that America's strength lay not only in ingenuity, but in volume. Every convoy of the Red Ball Express, every advancing division from Normandy to the Rhine, relied on these anonymous machines and the soldiers who drove them. They were not glamorous like tanks or bombers, but they carried the weight of victory. The rolling proof that in modern war, industry and logistics had become the true engines of conquest. Behind the roar of engines and the endless convoys of the Red Ball Express lay its true driving force, the men behind the wheel. Nearly 3/4 of these drivers were African American soldiers, men serving in a segregated army that denied them frontline combat roles, but entrusted them with one of the most vital and dangerous missions of the war, keeping the Allied advance alive. Archival footage and photographs reveal their faces, weary, determined, resolute, framed by dust and diesel smoke as they guided their trucks through darkness, rain, and the constant threat of attack. The irony was profound. In an army divided by race, the United States relied on these very men to sustain its campaign of liberation across Europe. They were expected to deliver fuel, ammunition, and rations across hundreds of miles of perilous roads, often under fire from Luftwaffe strafing runs and German snipers hidden along the routes. Yet despite the discrimination they endured, their performance was nothing short of extraordinary. Many drove for 48 to 60 hours straight, taking turns sleeping beside the wheel while co-drivers slapped their shoulders to keep them awake. When engines failed, they repaired them with scavenged parts and sheer ingenuity. Every delivery run was a battle of endurance fought not with rifles or tanks, but with grit, exhaustion, and courage. They were the human engine of the Red Ball Express, unsung heroes whose contributions went largely unrecognized in their time. In the history of the war, their story stands as both triumph and tragedy, a testament to how those forced to the margins of their own nation's ideals nonetheless carried that nation's armies to victory. By early September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become more than a logistical operation. It was the bloodstream of the Allied war machine. In a blur of motion and noise, its impact could be seen at every level of the front. A truck grinding to a halt beside a waiting Sherman tank, a fuel can lifted by tired hands, an artillery shell rolled into a gun breech, a soldier unwrapping a K ration before returning to the line. Each act, mundane in isolation, formed part of a vast mechanical rhythm that sustained the momentum of the Allied advance. The numbers tell the true scale of this achievement. At its peak, the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. Fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts, flowing with near-industrial precision from the Normandy beaches to the front lines hundreds of miles away. In just 83 days of operation, the system moved more than 412,000 tons of material, the equivalent of what a well-functioning national railway could transport in the same period. Yet the Red Ball achieved this without rails, relying instead on nothing more than engines, manpower, and relentless coordination. For the Germans, the shock was both strategic and psychological. Their commanders, conditioned by the constraints of fuel scarcity and the paralysis of bombed railways, simply could not comprehend how an enemy could sustain such velocity for so long. Every new Allied advance, every town liberated, every tank refueled was a testament to the logistical power they had fatally underestimated. The Red Ball Express proved that in modern warfare, the decisive battles were not always fought at the front, but along the roads behind it, where victory rode on the back of 1,000 trucks. To the German High Command, the Red Ball Express was not merely a logistical operation, it was a revelation of something far more terrifying. The first shock was one of scale. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance photo showing endless streams of trucks on French roads was more than an image of movement. It was a portrait of industrial might. To a German general, each vehicle represented not just a machine, but a factory line in Detroit, a refinery in Texas, a dockyard in New York. It was the physical manifestation of an enemy whose homeland remained untouched, whose production capacity seemed limitless, and whose power was measured in tonnage rather than tactics. The second shock cut deeper: fuel extravagance. For years, German divisions had fought starvation battles for fuel, grounding aircraft and immobilizing panzers for lack of a few barrels of gasoline. Now they watched, stunned, as the Americans sent thousands of fuel-hungry trucks roaring across France, consuming vast quantities of fuel merely to deliver more of it. To the German mind, trained in austerity and conservation, this bordered on insanity. Yet what appeared wasteful was, in truth, a demonstration of abundance so immense it defied logic. The Red Ball Express symbolized an economy so vast that it could afford inefficiency and still win. The third and most profound shock was philosophical. The Red Ball Express was not elegant, not efficient, and certainly not sustainable by German standards. It chewed through engines, burned out men, and devoured spare parts at an alarming rate. But in the American way of war, that did not matter. Machines could be replaced. Men could be rotated. What mattered was momentum, constant, unrelenting, overwhelming. The Germans had long believed war to be an art of precision and control. The Americans had turned it into an act of industrial will. The Red Ball Express proved that victory in the modern age would belong not to the cleverest strategist, but to the power that could simply outproduce, outlast, and outdrive all others. By the winter of 1944, the great convoys of the Red Ball Express began to fade from the roads of France. With the port of Antwerp finally opened and the shattered railways of Europe restored, the emergency that had birthed the operation was over. Archival footage captures the transition: ships unloading at bustling docks, locomotives churning through liberated countryside, the steady rhythm of a continent returning to order. The Red Ball Express, born of crisis and sustained by exhaustion, had fulfilled its mission. It had carried an army across a continent and ensured that the momentum of liberation never faltered. Yet its legacy reached far beyond logistics. The Red Ball Express embodied the fundamental truth of modern warfare: that wars are no longer won solely by generals and divisions, but by nations and their factories. The German High Command had prepared to fight armies. What they encountered instead was an economy in motion. A war machine capable of producing, moving, and replacing at a scale beyond comprehension. The endless line of trucks that snaked through France was not merely a feat of organization. It was the physical expression of industrial dominance. For every shell a German gun could fire, America could deliver 100 more. For every mile a German horse could walk, a deuce and a half could drive 10, day and night, through mud, fire, and exhaustion without stopping. The Red Ball Express was the sound of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago roaring across Europe, an unstoppable river of steel and fuel that no tactic could dam. German officers could see it with their own eyes, but they could never truly grasp it, for they were witnessing the triumph of industry over ideology, and the moment when the modern world learned that wars are ultimately won in the factories, long before the first shot is ever fired.